Hi everyone, I'm Helen from Frida Moss Designs. Welcome to this short tutorial about knitting in the round. We knit in the round when we want to produce a tube with no seams for things like socks, gloves, hats and snoods. What I'm going to teach you about today is the tools you need to knit in the round, how to cast on and split your stitches across the needles, how to join the round and then how to start knitting in the round. So let's start with the tools you need for knitting in the round. When you knit in the round you work with double pointed knitting needles, so called because they have a point at either end. Many of you will be used to working with single pointed knitting needles like this, so called because they have a point at one end and a stopper at the other. Double pointed knitting needles are normally in a multiple of 4 or 5. I tend to work mostly with 4 double pointed knitting needles because I find it more stable to work in the round like that. But sometimes you need to use 5 double pointed knitting needles, usually when you're working on a bigger piece of work. But for something like socks or gloves, relatively small tubes of knitting, normally 4 double pointed knitting needles is fine. When you work with double pointed knitting needles, you always have one needle which is your working knitting needle and the remaining needles are the needles that hold the stitches. So the first thing to do is cast on and divide those stitches evenly across the holding needles. I've cast on 31 stitches, which is one extra than I need. I'm planning to work on 30 stitches. And I'll explain why you need that extra stitch in a minute. So to divide those 31 stitches evenly across the 3 holding needles, I just divide by 3. So that will be 10 on the first needle, 10 on the second needle and 11 on the last needle. And to move them from one needle to the next, it's simply a case of slipping the stitches across. So we'll start with the first needle and we need 10 on this one. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And now I'll just slide them onto the second needle. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and then we're left with 11. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 on that last needle. So now it's time to join the round, and to do that we're joining the end of the row to the beginning of the row. Before you join the round, it's really important to make sure your stitches haven't got twisted around the needles at all. So make sure the cast on edge runs round the bottom like that and isn't getting looped over the needles at all. And keep that in mind as you join the round together. So to join the round, this is where that extra stitch comes into play. What you need to do is move that last stitch off the last needle and onto the first needle. Take your time with this because it's a little bit fiddly. So there, we've done that. We've moved that last stitch from the last needle to the first needle. So now it's time to start knitting. Here's your working needle, and the very first time on the very first row you're going to knit 2 together, and that joins the round securely. Like so. So now we're just going to knit along the first needle, working the stitches from the holding needle onto the working needle. it always feels a little bit unstable on the first round, so just take your time. So when you've got to the end of that first needle, that holding needle becomes your working needle. So move along round to the second needle and start knitting again. Now on the very first stitch, make sure you pull it tighter than you would normally on a normal knitting stitch. And that's important because it keeps the stitch between the two needles nice and tight, so you don't get any loose stitching or laddering there. So we're working along now on the second needle. To the end, and again your working needle becomes a holding needle and your holding needle becomes the working needle, and you carry on round. Let's loosen a bit of yarn off there. So on to the third needle of the first round, and again make sure you keep that first stitch nice and tight to prevent it being loose, and carry on. And that's the end of your first round. I'll work another round now, just so you get the gist of it. So nothing changes, you're working the first needle of your second round now, but it's the same concept, so make sure you pull that first stitch nice and tight, and off you go. Now I'm actually demonstrating how you do stocking stitch working in the round, and you'll notice a difference between this and working in the flat for a stocking stitch, because when you're working in the round you're always working on the right side. You don't very often work on the wrong side when you're working in a round, and so you don't need to do any purl stitches for stocking stitch. You just go round and round doing knit stitches. The other thing worth mentioning is, although we did that knit two together on the very first round to get us a good secure join, you do still find that for the first maybe 2 or 3 rows, the start or end of the round can be a little bit loose. But by the time you've done 2 or 3 rows, as long as you've been following my tip about pulling that first stitch of the row nice and tight, you'll find that that disappears. So there we have it. I won't go any further for today because I wanted to just explain the concept of knitting in the round. And as you can see, a tube is starting to form. So that teaches you the basics of knitting in a round. I've shown you how to cast on and split the stitches, how to join the round, and how to start knitting in the round. There's more you can learn, for example, how to work a rib in the round, so a knit 1 purl 1 rib or a knit 2 purl 2 rib. There's also how you turn the heel of a sock and do increases and decreases in the round, and these are all slightly more advanced techniques. And finally, casting off. There's very little difference between casting off in the round and casting off when you knit flat. It's the same concept, you're just casting off more needles. I hope you found that useful, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you on our next tutorial. Thanks for watching.